Michelle.
Daniel.
OG
OG Rose.
And today we're talking about
The Amish! Yay! Michelle's been reading a book.
Woohoo! But yeah, it's been really fascinating so far. Called The Riddle of the Amish by Donald Kraybill. I think it's probably one of my brother's books, to be honest.
Nice.
I really think he had some like class at Emory where he just this is one of
Instead
his.
of the Amish?
No, I just think that.
Because he could have just gone down the road to learn about the Amish, but had to go off to Emory.
Yeah, well, so I, for a large part of my childhood, I grew up about an hour away from Lancaster County.
Yeah.
Which is the oldest and most prolific, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Amish settlement in the United States.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
pretty interesting. And yeah, I mean, it's got me thinking about a lot of things reading this book because, there are a lot of, this isn't shocking, stereotypes about Amish or whoever, right? Whatever
Sure.
group of people. And it's interesting to learn more of the, get more in-depth insight into the way they live and why they do things that they do or don't do. And it also, for me, is very interesting in light of our work of belonging again, because, we talk about that as an option, right? Like people can...
Yeah. More isolationist.
Yeah, an isolationist approach is what some people may choose in light of pluralism or be born into if you're Amish, right?
Sure.
So, to me, it's fascinating to dive deeper into that because it's like, okay, yeah, that's, it's sort of almost a token like the Amish, but what are the Amish doing?
Yeah.
That to me is really interesting and I think important too.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the things you find interesting or stereotypes that you find the book is overturning?
Well, I think that one of the main things, I already brought this up to you, but the thing is that they sometimes do actually utilize technology. It can be thought that they just don't use any at all, right? At all, right? But they actually, they really keep a arm's length or 2 arms length way they keep technology at arm's length, and I think it's something somewhat democratic in the sense that they have times where they meet to decide what technology is allowed or not.
Is that like once a year or how often is that?
I don't know about those. I mean, I know that they have communion twice a year and they actually have church every other week.
Interesting.
They have a very much slower pace of life. They even, some of the old Amish, they set their clock differently than moderns. And apparently the Amish call moderns English.
Interesting.
They speak typically Dutch and German,
right,
and maybe another dialect or something like that, and often can speak English because they may have business that deals with English people, but they don't call them like non-Amish. They call them English people, which is kind of funny. So anyone who's not Amish is an English person. Which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I think just the idea that there are things that may seem, the title has the word riddle in it, right? And it's definitely kind of like a social analysis where it's looking at what are the riddles on their side and on the modern side. The author just chose to say moderns as everyone else who's not Amish, basically. And, just for example, like they'll ride in a car, but they won't own a car. Or they will possibly seek like a lawyer's assistance with their business, but they would not allow or promote their child to become a lawyer. Really. So there's some interesting sort of things that are puzzling about, or can seem puzzling to outsiders about that, like, or they now allow their people to wear sneakers.
Right.
I mean, black sneaker, like, is very plain, but they can do that, right? Or use certain synthetic fabrics or things like that. But they all wear there's a dress code, and a lot of it's still hand sewn. So it's interesting things like that, where I guess the stereotype wouldn't have you see these things, right? These nuances.
Right.
But then if you kind of live near, you might start to think, that's funny. Why do they do this and not that, or blah, blah, blah. And I think what it made me think about as a larger point is how easy it is to think of what mainstream people maybe say hypocritical or hypocrisy, but what maybe philosophers might call contradiction, depending on what.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in German idealism, it's completely different to use the term contradiction in a Hegelian sense. But what I mean to say is that people can find contradictions quite easily. If you have any proximity to the person or to the people, you will likely see things that to you seem a bit contradictory.
Sure.
And I think that's important because what I take away from it is you shouldn't use that as a reason to not learn from those people or that person, because you yourself will present your own contradictions, but you won't see them, right? Because for you, it's all just one narrative of your life.
Yeah.
And the historical process is really, really important to understand why these things start to exist. And the author says that when you understand more about what is the driving thematic thing to think about Luber and Alex's work, or Andrew and Alex's work. It's like, if you think about the thematic stuff, you realize, oh, wait a second, that's actually not like a contradiction, or that's not so puzzling after all, because they do it for these particular reasons. And yes, you might draw different conclusions than they do, but it reveals something that's really important about understanding that, people think contradiction in the mainstream, and they think, oh, the person's just, everything they do must be like kind of now ungrounded or unjustified or wrong. It's probably a bit of both. Some right things, some wrong things. But overall, when you see the theme, I think it can humble you a bit more to be receptive to learning from that thematic thing that drives the person or the group. So I hope.
No, I think it's excellent. I mean, it's very tricky because as finite human beings, we can't learn everything or go in depth on everything.
Yeah.
And yet the surface impression is almost always wrong. Or it certainly tends to leave out the nuance or the kind of details. So for example, another tricky thing is you find yourself having to use categories to explain sociological realities, but those categories themselves are fuzzy. There's something isolationist about the Amish, but then it's not a hard isolationist, right? So you find there's being something about Japan that is Deleuzian, but then there is forms of Deleuzianism that actually are more of a Hegelian negativity, as maybe a Terence Blake was emphasized, like he was at the retreat. And yet we need categories to think, but we also have to hold those categories in a kind of open-handedness.
Yeah.
What's very interesting with the Amish is what you see there is not so much an anti-technology, but an awareness that technology is never an individual choice. In the sense of it is the choice to use technology is not merely going to affect the individual that uses the technology. We talk in Belonging Again Part 1, which this is what a lot of sociologists point out. What my neighbor chooses to do does affect me.
Yeah.
Maybe you say it shouldn't, but it does. If my neighbor is an atheist and I'm a Christian, knowing that the person near me is an atheist destabilizes my own beliefs.
Yeah.
Or knowing that they're a lawyer and I'm not, I'm just a plumber or something. There's a destabilization that occurs, maybe for good, maybe for bad, but that's going to have an impact on social relations. Marx understood that if capitalism is introduced to a society, then the abstract form of social use will be the organizing principle by which people decide what has value and not. And it's not the case that you can use the abstract social value to organize economic activity and your neighbor doesn't. Once a certain technology or an economic structure is introduced, it's not isolated. And what's very interesting is what you see in the Amish is it's almost a kind of an awareness that you need to make democratic technological essence. Heidegger talked about technological essence. There's this idea that once a technology is introduced to a culture, it unleashes dynamics. We talked in the class, Look at the Birds of the Air, about dynamics. And if your neighbor is using a cell phone and you're not, that impacts your relationship with your neighbor, because your neighbor has it. You just know your neighbor has that technology, and then you have to ask the question, why don't I have it? And there are certain dynamics that are unleashed.
Yeah, I mean, just a simple point. We've talked many times about it before, but I don't think everybody always thinks about it this way, simply because technology tends to do your thinking for you.
Yes.
So. But it's a very important point that the Amish live out, which is that a phone on your bedside table is in your bedroom, right? Like,
Yes.
or in your home, or constantly with you, is different than a phone at the end of your farm property.
Yes. Yes.
Right? That you could, that's on a phone line or something
Yes.
like this. Because that's another example. They will use that.
Yes.
Or they will maybe have a phone at their business. And so that's different.
Yeah.
Like, it's just fascinating. I mean, again, it's fascinating to realize how important that realization is.
Yes.
And I think everybody kind of nods and says like, oh yeah, well, we know that.
Yeah.
But we don't really live the way like we know that. Whereas I think for them, they seemingly do more so, at least, where they say they'll have like very, very long meetings. Like I was reading this one section on just literally the particular ways or particular literally voltage of like a tractor engine, maybe, that you would even be able to use. And they won't use heavy equipment on their fields, but they will around their barns.
Yeah.
So it's like, and you could just be like, that's so silly. It's so particular. It's so that's stupid, right? Like,
Right.
you've got the technology, just use it, right? But for them, they say no. And again, it can seem completely outlandish, and in some ways it is. But it's also it shows this point that that I've said, where a phone that's constantly with you is completely different. Like, it's almost a different type of technology than the phone you have at the end of your farmland on a line.
Well,
like it's completely different.
Well,
because,
there's not that. I mean, there's a way in which the Amish have a greater awareness of neoliberalism in the Heideggerian technological essence than moderns, the English.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like, that's why I think this kind of nuance to the Amish is very important, and perhaps it is ideologically advantageous of neoliberalism to refer to them as anti-technology.
Well, right, exactly.
Because it's almost propaganda, when instead you have more of a kind of awareness that technology is communal. It's always communal, and it always has because there's always an effect.
It impacts the family.
It affects social relations.
Yeah. And I don't know, I guess sometimes, do you get technology that seems to be aware of this to a degree? Like, let's optimize face-to-face contact by having, I don't know if you saw that commercial for like this little, basically, device you wear that's like a iPhone, but it can like pop up like a screen on your hand. Like it's
I think I have seen that.
It's interesting. So they're like, well, look, we're trying to prioritize face-to-face interaction of human beings. Kind of reminds me of that. But to have people actually look at each other.
Sure.
And I guess what I'm saying is that doesn't all technology think that it's being aware of how it impacts the community and relationships?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, it thinks, oh, now you're going to be able to call your grandma more easily. Now you're going to be able, I think there's this general, assumption that we are thinking about it having communal impacts, and we have thought about it, and we have decided it's good. Or that the whole process just gets blurred into, like, the technology. Now, I will say, from an experiential perspective of being in college and still being in, like, the flip phone era pretty much, things weren't presented like that. Just suddenly everybody was using something.
Yeah.
There was no necessarily ethic. Like, I also didn't watch a bunch of TV, so I don't know what the commercials were saying. But it was just like suddenly everybody had it, that was the weird thing. It's almost as if either people weren't thinking about the impact, or I certainly wasn't thinking about the impact.
Sure.
Like, I would. Anyways, I'm just
technology is generally spread by market forces.
Yeah.
And market forces don't even have a category, or certainly does not draw attention to the category of social relations. I mean, again, looking at...
Do you think that could be a veneer? Like, if they do bring it up in their commercials, of course they're going to say that, because they're not just like, we're just doing this for profit.
Well, what they tend to do, market tends to talk about connectivity and, socializing, but social relations, and as a term from theory, say Marx, is kind of a different thing. Because what Marx is talking about, in many of the great sociologists, is the fact that social relations end up mediated by the logic of capital, or the logic of technological essence or fungibility. Like, social relations are always framed.
Yeah.
And they're framed by the dynamics of markets or technology or so on and so forth. And the issue is basically, under capitalism, you don't really think about that. You just introduce the product. Individuals decide if they want it or not. They buy it, and then it spreads, and you go from there. But you're not consciously... Yeah. You don't draw attention to social mediation, if you will.
Well, and I think... Sorry, it just came to mind because I was thinking of something else in the book that it talks about, where it talks about the Amish have like a value of small, like things being small, because if you, whenever it gets big, you have this you get distance, right? And you get impersonalization and stuff like this. Well, what I'm thinking is that, you know, when it comes to the market force of some sort of product that's put out there, like it's almost like the train left the station or something. You know, it's already left the station. It's not like you have, you know, in an Amish community, it's almost like they have a stronger membrane.
Yes.
Because they're stronger membership. Like,
yes.
That's why they also have shunning. But it also means that their membership is extremely, you know, valuable.
Yes.
They've created it to be very valuable because of such extreme positions on that. And, you know, that's why it can be very disagreeable. But it also shows that such an extreme kind of such a thing as shunning, which was a weird, that actually caused a split actually between the Mennonites and the Amish. But that's a long story, but it got into it in the book. But the point of the matter is that it's wild though, because at the same time, it's like, whoa, hyper membership because of that. Like, it's a strange oscillation, not oscillation, what do I want to say? It like comes together. You know what I mean? It's almost like love and grief come together. Like you can't have love without the risk of grief. And that's how it feels like. You can't have this super potent membership without the risk of shunning. You know what I'm saying? Then it's not like a desirable thing, you know. They talk a lot about it as like hoping to win back that person. It's not done out of like hatred, you know. But anyways, the point of the matter is, it's the stronger membership, which is a membrane. So, you know, you got floating around technology that's put out there in the market. It hits the membrane, and then they all kind of, you know, it's like when you get your immune system having a response or something like that. You don't, it's not necessarily attacked, but it's not the best analogy. But everybody pauses, and then like the members will kind of gather to say, we need to have a meeting about this to decide. Well, there's no membranic force like that in open society. And so it's just such a way faster of a process where it just is assimilated. Like, there's no membrane there. So it's just, not that I'm saying there is no membrane, but essentially, if we were to make this comparison,
no, the point of capitalism is to remove membranes. Is to make everything fungible.
It's kind of just osmosifies into the structure.
I mean, if there's membranes, that affects markets. Like the hope.
Or maybe it's a weak membrane or something like this.
Well, global capitalism, for good and for bad, wants there to be a global market.
Which is understandable.
That would maximize access and profit and so on and so forth. And if the market is indeed offering real goods, well then, you know, there's a sense in which it would be ethical by which to have a global market and have global access, right? If capitalism's offering clean water, then you'd want a global market, right? The issue is that capitalism as a system does not necessarily know the difference between clean water and cell phones. Customers have to know the difference, and if they don't, because they're not able to think beyond the logic of, say, convenience or whatever value form they've been habituated into, well, then they just buy whatever is presented, and the dynamics then take a life of their own. This is why, you know, Michelle Bowens will talk about value competitions, or Zach Stein and Gaffney. The problem is capitalism plus people who are not able to think values beyond the capital value form, right? Like, to have kind of, you want to almost talk about value diversity, and diversity creates strength in the system, then you need people to be in capitalism who can think according to many, many different value forms. If they cannot do that, they're in trouble. But what you're saying, you know, but in order to maintain value forms beyond the capital form, you have to have spaces that are able to think a logic outside the market. And basically what the Amish have done is been intentional about making sure that space exists. Exactly. And if you don't, this is the point, if you are not somehow intentional about that space ain't just going to come into existence magically. Bless you.
Thank you.
The market's going to make sure it doesn't, right? And there's a real sense in which families, churches, religions, communal spaces have not done the work of making sure there are quote-unquote non-market spaces by which people can think alternative logics, whereas the Amish have. But it's really difficult to do that because you have to have some sort of membranes, and that tends to mean exclusion, in and out. Philip Reeve talks about that. Like, by definition, to have a separation from the market, there must be some filtration system, right? And no one wants to be the bad guy, and sometimes people use that to take advantage of other people. And what's your value system to maintain it? It's, it's really difficult. Well, one of the easier ways to do it is to just be very traditional. To be more of an emphasis on the traditional, or certainly a religion. Religion can provide that. I mean, the trick now, if one is not going to take that route, is thinking about how does one form membranes, if you will, that have an in and out that is able to think dynamics and then able to give enough communal support by which people can stick to those dynamics. That's a real challenge.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I think it's also what can definitely be learned from the Amish, and maybe even kind of implemented in its own way. Of course, it's going to be different, very different, because it might come from more of the individual vantage point. But you could say, wait a second, I should probably keep a kind of, membranic check on technology. So that's becoming more thoughtful, becoming more aware. But it also doesn't mean to necessarily not use it, or to not use it at all. Like you might put terms or conditions and limitations on it, right? But see, just that process it requires being a little slower to think through that. And I just think a lot about speed and Berlioz and how it's it's very, it's almost like it like I said, the train left the station. And yet we have to realize we can actually do something that is, I want to say countercultural, but what I mean to say is you can implement practices that can kind of foster a membranic phase. You know what I'm saying? To be able to allow yourself to become more thoughtful with how or what extent you would utilize a certain technology.
Oh, sure. And I mean, it should also be noted, and Dave at Theory Underground talks about this all the time. The Amish have that tradition where at a certain age, you can leave. You can leave, and a lot of people come back. So there's also an idea.
They have a very high return rate.
Now you could say, well, that's because they, train.
They're brainwashed.
They're brainwashed, or they train people to be fragile to not handle it. Well, whatever you want to say, the argument is there's some sort of communal binding there that people don't find elsewhere. And if you take the meaning crisis and all that seriously, that seems to be suggestive of it. I mean, what's very interesting is you could argue that no one has figured out how to have a structure at scale that manages to be conscious of dynamics of technology or systems to not end up in game theory problems.
Exactly.
What's very interesting, I mean, you could make the argument that, if Jim Rudd and Smackenberg and all these people are talking about multipolar traps or prisoner's dilemma or all this stuff happening where the world is being, the meta crisis, or are these game theory dynamics that are going to get the whole world destroyed, like a way to think about it, the multipolar trap. Rutt makes this example on the idea that nobody wants to go to war, but if you don't build up your army, then the other guy is going to take you over. So you build up your army, and then they build up their army, and everyone's building up their armies, which then create the conditions of war when nobody wants to go to war, because if you don't, the other guy will. So so the point is there's a dynamic that gets a life of its own once the nation state comes into existence, if you will. And there are many there's great Forrest Landry and different people talk about AI risk, right? But there's the problem. It's like, well, if we don't, sure, maybe AI will get us all killed, but if we don't build AI, the Chinese will and the Russians will, so we got to do it. And they know that if they don't do it, the Americans will do it. So everyone's speeding toward a Molark kind of trap, as Codex, Alexander, he talks about. So there's an idea of, well, how do you stop all this? Well, the Amish is showing you. You become, very aware. What you see in the Amish is an awareness that once you introduce the technology, once you introduce something, that dynamics begin, that then there is no easy answer to. Now, if you say, well, the Amish are too slow, that, retards development too much, well, that's a very, very fair argument to make, but what you can at least learn from them is some sort of awareness of once you start something, technology and systems bring dynamics, so you really want to think about it. And if you don't think about it, and it turns out there was a game theory problem lurking in the background you didn't know about, it's too late now.
Yeah.
It's too late.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's spot on. Sorry, another thing that's coming to mind that's somewhat related, but I was thinking back to the membranic point, the strong membrane.
Sure.
And that's because of strong membership. You literally have clothes that will identify you as such, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. I think what's fascinating about the Amish is while they have this strong membrane, they're actually relatively tolerant of other people groups.
Yeah.
And they're pacifist. I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure they're pacifists. So they're not going to attack people. They were themselves persecuted because of their descent, to the Catholic Church originally, in France and in the Netherlands. And I guess I bring this up because it's easy to simply associate borders, membranes, and boundaries with a higher threat of war. Usually it does. It can mean that, but it's also, they show this too, where it's not as if they are, just because they've got strong membrane, doesn't mean they're on the offensive or something like that. Yeah. And it's interesting, actually, one of the things I found rather interesting too about them is that they're not evangelical, right? They're not, they actually hold a really open hand to their own salvation, because they don't believe you can know that you are saved. When they hear that, they're like, that's quite presumptuous, basically, because they don't believe you can, which is so crazy. Another type of riddling thing, because it's like, well, y'all seem pretty sure that you're this separated people, kind of the royal priesthood, like the passage that we'll say in scripture. But what I mean to say is that from a personal perspective, they don't believe you can know that. You just trust and hope hope that what you're doing is honoring to God, that it would eventually basically it's not an earning salvation, but it's kind of like that it would play out salvation or something like that. So they don't believe you can know. So in a way that also keeps them tolerant, because they don't feel as if it's their place to say that another things about other type of beliefs that people have. Now within their own community, they'll have pretty strong beliefs about there's a German word, I can't remember how to pronounce it. It's like Gestaltate or something like that, or Gestalten or something, which is the core tenets of their faith, basically. A lot of it is humility, and so, for example, if you're very prideful, they will think that will lead to damnation, right? So it's like, oh, that seems really sure and certain. So it's again, it's that nuance of seems to be a type of they seem certain about certain things and uncertain about other things. But it makes me also think about what you talk about, Daniel, where we can't be certain, but we can be confident. Yeah. They seem to live out a type of they try to be confident in what God's word has said, not so much in their own ability to decide if they know or something like that, which I just think is pretty wild, because that's quite actually different. That's quite different than a lot of mainstream Christianity, which has a sort of they have an identification with, we're saved, I'm saved, and there's and I get it. It's just that for the Amish, they almost have an identity in their clothes, their food, their actual way of living, not their identification with salvation, because they really don't believe you should have the place of knowing such a thing. Only God knows. Well, so it's interesting to me. Well, but I just wanted to bring that up on this again, passive, membranic, non-aggressive, and then this point about salvation.
Well, I mean, there are a number of counterintuitive realities. Strong membranes tend to correlate with less conflict. You would say strong membrane, that's going to be colonial and imperialistic, but it's the exact opposite, because when you have a strong membrane, you're more confident.
Sure.
A weak membranes can lead to war and conflict because there's insecurity. Unfortunately in world history, governments will send their people to war when there are domestic issues, like there's a weak membrane per se, not more so than international disagreement.
I see. To
Like,
kind of reestablish.
Yes,
their,
exactly.
yeah,
War
domestic
tends to be done
identity.
to restore a membrane, not because a membrane is weak. It's
Interesting. Or you mean because it's weak, not because it was super strong.
Correct.
Yeah.
Like when a membrane is strong, then there's less incentive to go to conflict.
Yeah.
Wars tend to be to strengthen membrane.
Yeah,
and
that's an
peace
interesting
tends
point,
to be
yeah.
there's that the membrane is strong. Now there is examples where membranes can be strong and colonial, but one should not, or imperialistic, but one should not conflate strong membrane and conflation, because there's the possibility of a strong membrane that's based on a commons or a community, and that's what you see in the Amish. The problem is we're just so used to there not being communal membranes that we automatically associate membrane with national boundary,
Nationalism,
border,
yeah.
nationalism, and so on. But I think, before I forget, it also should be noted that I think that idea of the Amish wouldn't have, if you're Amish, you're not going to become a lawyer, but they'll use lawyers. That also is tied, I think, to this idea of not knowing who's saved, because instead the choice not to allow the Amish to become lawyers is about unleashing a certain dynamic into the community, not saying that we're better than lawyers. So it is the logic of the Amish is about a commons. It's about a community and maintaining a commons.
100%.
The issue is I think honestly the mind naturally associates Amish with, say, when you see a particular outfit that everyone's wearing, you associate maybe with Islam, where you see particular outfits and you go, oh, that's, if you were saved, you would be wearing that, and there's a certain certainty. Now, even in Islam, there's a certain nuance there, because there can be a lot of universalism where Allah's mercy overcomes his wrath, and so it's not even so simple there. But if you're the average Western mind, religion, particular
you just
outfit,
think fundamentalism.
You think fundamentalism.
You just think all of that kind of
and you
gets
have no
lumped
category
into fundamentalism, which is what the point about the evangelical certainty of salvation.
Yes.
That for them is like, whoa, that's fundamental in the sense that you think you know the mind of God, whereas for them they're like, oh, we kind of just humble ourselves and realize that we're nobody. That's the other thing with wearing the same things.
Yes.
Why do they do that too? It's because they don't want to make it like I'm my own idea.
It's a humble thing.
Yeah, it's a humility thing where it's like, who am I?
Yeah.
Right? Who am I to be, John P. Smith, whatever.
Yeah.
Like they really, and sure, that can obviously be, there can be problems with that too, but it's just, they really, really, really value community over the individual.
Yeah.
And they do that because, for many reasons to continue that, the strength of the community over the individual, because they need that community. Like they literally purposefully, certain technologies they don't use require them to work in small groups to accomplish things.
Well, I mean, you could argue the meaning crisis is an example where there's a whole lot of individuals who wish there was a community they could value over the individual, but it's not there.
Sure.
Now the problem is, under the logic of capitalism, basically our mind says individualism or collectivism, communism or capitalism. Therefore, any sort of collectivist logic is dangerous. Sure, if by collectivism you're thinking a governmental project, again, we don't have the category of commons or communitarianism or that kind of thing, and so we have no way to think of particular fittedness, which is a kind of middle between individual and collective. Like particular, you could even say particularity as between individual and community and collective.
But I didn't mean to burst in there. I just think that it's interesting because our minds can do that, where we think, oh, veiled, oh, straw hat, oh, that, like, and we think fundamental. We think a fundamentalistic mindset. But really the nuance may be that, oh, wow, this person, while they dress a certain way, now you could, again, that's a hypocrisy. You could say, well, it's like, well, clearly you think that you're a saved people.
Yes.
Like, you wear this clothes and you kind of, you esteem that more than
Yes.
wearing anything else a modern would wear, right?
Yeah.
But for them, they're like, no, we don't actually, we would never really feel comfortable saying if we're saved because we don't know, right? It's just fascinating to me because I think it shows me that how we understand being fundamental or having fundamentalism, whatever qualities, it's like can we ascribe that to just whatever we assume to be fundamentalist, you know? And I think the answer is no, but also the fact that it's a crazy bothness and a nuance there.
Well, I mean, there's nothing more shocking, you could say.
And maybe that is more fundamentalist, and the fundamentalist, you know, evangelical Christians, you know, conservatives are like not fundamental. You know, you could say that,
sure.
you could,
well, but
just
the
depending on
issue
how you
is,
define that
like,
word.
I mean,
you know,
it's arguably nothing more stunning than really learning the internal logic of a people.
absolutely.
Like, you
Yep.
know, we argue in the paper on critical thinking that basically critical thinking is not possible without empathy. But by empathy, we don't mean sympathy. We mean entering into the internal logic of another, of the other, if you will. And it truly is shocking when you enter into Islam, like really try to think Islam according to its internal logic, or Amish, or communism, or whatever. It's shocking because it turns out people have reasons that are not reducible to stupidity or dumb or irrational.
Or
like,
or whatever.
it turns out they thought of that, you know, and they've got a explanation for that.
Yeah.
And to really be aware of all of these internally consistent systems and to move into them and to see them by their own internal logic is a very I mean, maybe thought doesn't begin until that occurs.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, certainly not critical thought. I think also what's just really important, like with the outfit example, if you make a rule that says this is the outfit we're going to wear, you free people from the dynamics of fashion and then all the money of spending on new outfits.
It's
right?
funny because they say, like, you know, you think that we all look quite similar, right?
Yeah.
We're all, but you know, it's kind of interesting, right? Because just check like out some typical algorithm feed for somebody who's into like women's fitness, okay? More or less, women are going to be wearing more or less
they
the
look
same
the
thing.
same.
Pretty
Yeah, they
much.
do.
I mean, it's kind of like the tight fitted fitness leggings or whatever, and you know, the tight sports top of some sort. And it's like, I'm just saying that it's funny. It's not like you get like crazy diversity. You know, you get some homogeny. Yes, you might get different colors, patterns.
And they have no protection
like
from the algorithm.
No, and the thing is, certain people, like, I think that it's almost like, I think it was actually directly in the book where it said something where the Amish feel it's more honest. Because they're like, we accept that we have some sort of dress code, like that we wear these things, and we aren't going to be, like, we will not let the market force decide that, oh, we're being super individualistic and you know, expressing ourselves while we wear pretty much the same thing as Sally wears. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting. The other thing, I think I brought it up at the net, but you know, it says modern man is obsessed with finding himself, and the Amish is engaged in losing himself. And so anyways, it's a fascinating you know, dynamic, and obviously there's probably even a nuance there where it's a bothness, because you know, a lot of times losing oneself is to gain Christ in the Christian dynamic of the Amish, right? But whereas for the modern, there's a sense of finding myself so that I can, like, you know, lose my sense of limitation, and I can be free. So there's I just want to say, like, there obviously is nuance even with that, but the general framework is like, that's fascinating. What do these things end up bearing out in different ways, or what are the sort of like similarities you could even see there? And like I'm saying, this point about the homogenous market forces, algorithm, everybody kind of like, oh, that's really fascinating. Like, a lot of people wearing the same things, you know. It's just like, it's just to sort of step back and be a little bit more humble to the point of like, y'all are wearing the same things. Like that's you're all brainwashed, and you just, you know, you're not allowed any free expression, you know. Whereas for them, they put their free expression into quilt making. Like, they allow freedom of expression they don't use that language at all, but they cultivate creativity in their trades, in their crafts, in their food, in their gardens, you know.
Very, 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 very rarely is there any actual individual expression. It's almost always status anxiety. And basically, like, individual expression would really require a whole lot of, like, learning. You'd have to learn beauty and aesthetics and art and skills. Like, individual expression is
Which is so easy to capture that, you're saying? Like it's
individual expression is something that takes like 30 years to even begin to perhaps learn or know how to do. Like, how do you express yourself as an individual versus just mimicry? Or figure out how to even design or find clothes that come close to representing your taste, or to be able to recognize music that really captures your emotional state. That is a incredible developmental like training. That's not individual expression. To really know, know how to express and to do it well is quite difficult. It would be an art form. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would require cultivation. That, again, kind of speaks to the lost tradition of culture being something you earned or learned. Like, maybe after you read 100 novels, you can talk about individual expression, but until then, you're just, you're not really expressing. You're probably mimicking. It's probably momentous. It's probably, and honestly, in our society today, it's almost always status anxiety. Yeah. And so, what the Amish are doing by simply having a dress code is, one, they're saving you from having to keep up with the Joneses in fashion, which can be very expensive. Two, even if you say, well, I don't care what everyone is wearing, well, just the act of mental energy of having to come to that place where you don't care what others think, the Amish are saving their people from having to do that. And then, of course, if you're the kind of person that says, I don't care what other people think, I don't need to keep up with fashion, you're on a road toward being alone. So there's really no good way out of the fashion trap, if you will, unless the community simply absolves you of having to worry about that. Now, you can say, well, that sounds like the road to totalitarianism. Yeah, it can be, But Philip Reef pointed out that people don't so much want to choose so much as they want to feel chosen. Yeah. And if you don't have a community that allows you to feel, oh, wow, I'm chosen here, the people here care about me, there's something about removing anxiety from people that make you feel chosen because you feel cared about. Yeah. Now, that can go down the road of oppression, of course. There are no easy answers here. But there is also an awareness in the Amish that a lot of what is, in quote-unquote, supposedly freedoms are not really freedoms. They're just keeping up with status anxiety. They're just having to work a job you don't want to do to make money, to spend it on things that you don't really need. That you
feel overwhelmed by because you want to declutter your house.
Yeah, that's right. And then you're also working, so you're buying gasoline. Like, you got to spend a whole lot of money to work, to make money. There are dynamics. Dynamics are unleashed. And the community, what you see in the Amish is like, let's really, really, really think about these dynamics before we unleash them. And you can say, well, they're really slow. Yeah. But there's also an awareness that once the dynamics are released, it's too late. Yeah. So you might want to be slow, because otherwise, you could be in trouble. And again, I think it just really is important to see the Amish as a defense of a commons more than a dogmatic religion, because that's what we need to think of today. Yeah. Defenses of non-market spaces, and then you can make sense of why the Amish would, ride in a car and not own a car. Well, because it's not the car that in of itself is immoral. They're trying to defend themselves from certain dynamics. They don't think they're saved because they're Amish. They think they're defended from certain dynamics. They're, it's a commons movement more than it is a dogmatic religious movement.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And, I was thinking too about just the fact that, I've seen Amish on trains before and things like that. It's like they're not going to go blow up the railway line because they think it's evil to have technology. It's like they actually make communal decisions as an offering. Like I mentioned this at the net too. That really shifted my perspective as well, where it's not so much an anti-technology. It's like actually we realized that would be quite an inconvenience, but we also realized we would lose our convening with each other. So we offer that back up as an offering to make a ritual of their common life, like their common life, right? The common things they do. So that weeding and, making their jams and quilting their quilts for their family and friends, and sometimes the public, which they may sell it to, become like the things that maintain their I want to say almost like cultivation of righteousness for them religiously, but also, that cultivate literally their community as well, And I was thinking too, because they said how there's a lot of, like, there's no pretense there are a lot of Amish people who will talk about, you were saying, like, feeling chosen, right? It's funny because while they really don't encourage, like, people using their names or being in, like, public art shows with, like, their name on stuff, even writers will often use, like, they'll use a pen name or they'll be anonymous as Amish writers. But the thing about that is it's interesting because, that feeling from Cheers, right? Like, everybody knows your name. Everybody does know your name there. Like, there's no pretense. You're not having to perform or kind of be someone. You're not, because everybody knows you, like, deeply knows you, intimately knows you, and they, that everybody has a role and a part to play in that community. It's, and I think too, their perspective on work, like, work's not something you're like, oh, I can't wait for the weekend. For them, work is, you delight in that work. It's probably really hard work a lot of times because, again, not all of the technologies, but they see it as a way to commune with each other. To learn, pass on skills that they've utilized and, like, leaned upon for many generations. So it's just interesting because just thinking of, sorry, really quick, even biblically though, like, work was called toil after the fall, etc. And it's like, I guess in a way, it's not like anyone's like necessarily gleeful about sweaty work out square baling because they won't use a baler necessarily, But it's interesting to think of that as, like, because even young kids will help work. 10-year-olds might be riding, a crew of horses, whatever they call that. Horses to or mules to pull wagons, etc. But it's I do want to think it could possibly be quite freeing in some sense, like, because you do see your whole community sees a value in what you do. Like, nobody thinks you're stupid because you won't use the higher technology, because you see as something, as preserving something really integral to that community. And then also you know how to do it. You can do it yourself. You learn how to do it yourself. And so I don't know, I've been thinking about that too, just like our attitude toward work in general. And how I'm like, is it true, or is this just, like, kind of wishful thinking to see a people group or a family where it's like we actually delight in our chores versus, like, oh, it's my chores, I just got to get them done. You know what I mean? Anyways, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think, there's a way in which it is extremely important that I would just emphasize that what you see in the Amish is not an anti-technology spirit, but a very deep awareness of all of the dynamics of technology seen in a Jacques-Ellul technological society, Heidegger technological essence, the idea that technology leads to a change in social relations that gets a life of its own. We make our tools and then our tools make us. Like, the Amish are an example of people that really know that. We don't seem to know that. We don't seem to know that. And I mean, part of the reasons why it might be difficult to delight in work in this sense is because we now work in the context of a technological essence that has made us in a manner where work is not part of social relations.
Well, but that is super. I mean, I think we're it's funny because as much as they're pegged as, like, the isolationists, which generally they are, their work itself, from
it's
what
communal.
It's very communal. So, but we have a day and age where so much is done by yourself. Just doing it by yourself. There's such and the individualistic spirit, which I'm not saying that's all bad, but it's that kind of you talk about, like, the myth of the rugged individual, et cetera, but there's, like, this way in which the individualism, and I should be able to do it by myself, and I'm weak if I can't do this by myself, and I don't need to rely on anyone else anyway, because I've got my internet resources. Not that there's anything wrong with internet, depending on what the internet resources are, but the point of the matter is people are doing stuff alone. That's simple, and it's just that mere fact makes people, it's a bit more of a drag or a dread to do.
Well, work is specialized. And technology introduces specialized work.
Well, I'm just thinking mostly to, like, chores and the way and people doing just the
Sure,
simple
sure,
stuff.
sure.
I mean, in terms of jobs, sure, I guess you may have a team of
But
people.
it's connected because people don't have time, energy, as Dave may say, to do the chores, or they don't, someone else is doing the chores, or it's not, or chores is...
It's either like you outsource it and get it paid
a lot
for,
more outsourcer people...
or you do it, or you're like doing your laundry by yourself.
Or you're doing your laundry by yourself. Yes, because, but the point is...
Maybe watch a movie while you do it or something.
People are fitting their chores into when they have time from their jobs. Versus their jobs equal their chores.
Which
I mean,
basically
is for the Amish.
Most
For the
Amish
Amish,
life, yeah.
for the Amish, their jobs are their chores.
Yep.
For the English, for the modern person, work and chores are different,
yep.
if you will. The key is that technology introduces specialized work. Like, coding, for example. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What are the chances your kids and spouse and community can do coding?
No,
right?
It's important you said specialized because they're very hesitant about that. But go ahead.
Yeah, so work and community are separated. Yeah. It necessarily is by specialization. Yeah. And that's a dynamic of work technology introduced that you didn't know technology was going to introduce.
You're like, whoops.
Yeah, and I mean, on the clothing thing, just as a note, if you're going to have fashion, then you have to have factories for the more complicated clothing and for the options, and then you have store, and whoops, you have capitalism. Like, even just having the option of different clothes would almost, just from that alone, create the entire capitalist order. And technology to make possible that clothing. So it's not merely a uniform of identification, but a way to stop the market that would have to in the corresponding technology that would have to exist to make possible varieties of fashion.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I was thinking when we were talking about the fashion topic before, just like it seems like such a little point, but I think it's might be valid where just the fact of like deciding what you're wearing. They're like, well, we're just going to go ahead and decide that for you.
Yeah.
So you literally don't have to use energy toward that, right?
Yeah, I mean, Cornel West will say, he one day just decided what his outfit was, and he wears it every day.
Same with Steve Jobs, and a lot of people who
do that.
Yeah. And there can be something to that. I mean, there's plenty of school, even institutional things that have uniforms or things like that.
Yeah, because if you don't have uniforms, then you have status anxiety.
And actually, it's interesting because obviously the Amish so aesthetically look homogenous in terms of their dress, but their clothes. But for much of human history, clothing was much more similar. Like men, you know what I mean? Yes. If you had an average man on a train ride, going somewhere, he'd probably have a hat. He'd probably have a certain type of waistcoat or whatever. He'd be. Most people used to dress up actually to go places, just to take a train ride or whatever. Most women might be wearing mid to floor length dress. Sure. What I'm saying is that there patterns, textures, fabrics. Like there have been some variations and sometimes more notable ones. But the point is that it was, generally speaking, I mean, this is, to reiterate, I mean, it's not as if, like, some idea of uniform dress is like, utterly shocking. It's just that the way that they dress, it looks so antiquated, right? Or it looks so rural or something compared to what most moderns wear or English wear. But it's fascinating. But just that idea of, like, I guess they just decided, too, that, maybe this isn't one of their top priorities for that decision, but there's sort of a we put our energy on other stuff, right? Versus like, what existential crisis am I going to have over my first day of school outfit? I'm joking, but sometimes those are real things that people can live with,
Yes.
Or like, do they look like the other girls or the other boys or whatever,
Yes.
They cool looking or whatever. Status anxiety, basically, to what you said.
Yes. For clothing not to look antiquated, you will need factories. Like, that's the issue. Like, of course they look... If their critique is against technological essence, to use that Heideggerian notion, then you have to have antiquated clothing, almost by definition.
Well, it's interesting to think about, I'm sure this is maybe a little reductionistic, but self-expression as requiring factories.
Well, that is the key.
That's a real thing. Like, that's a real point that needs to be...
The challenge that the Amish pose to the English, to us, to the world, is that the world is yet to figure out how to have variation, pluralism without technology winning. Without technological essence winning.
It's almost like they sacrifice some of this individual expression because they're like, well, look, we realize we can't get our cake and eat it too. Like, we cannot get our cake and eat it too. We kind of, moderns, I think, tend to live like they can get their cake and eat it too. Meanwhile, they're also really upset and sad about the cheap labor happening in some small country, East Asian country, because of the clothes that are being manufactured, but they'd like to be able to wear clothes that are kind of that expressive or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I'm just trying to say, like, there's this kind of, okay, we're going to sacrifice it here, but we can maybe enable you to be quite expressive in how you make saddles or something, which I know is kind of odd for us, but it's true that, I mean, think about like Amish craftsmanship. That's one of the things that they are like sought after for, right? Is their craftsmanship on whether it's barns or table making. You know? So anyway,
the secret sauce that has not been made is growing pluralism, growing diversity, without at the same time having growing homogeneity, mediocrity, and cheap worsening, like everything being the same, like clothing, cheap fabric, loss of craftsmen. There's another irony where there's an emphasis on individual expression while there's a loss of craftsmanship.
And quality of materials.
And quality. That's kind of an odd irony.
Sorry, really quick, not to push on this point, but why is it that sort of that desire to have, freedom of self-expression, does that necessarily have to correlate with, cheap labor factories that make, the cool colored clothes or something?
Well, if by individual expression you mean you want to have different clothing, different gadgets, different things, someone's got to provide the markets for you to get those goods. If by individual expression...
But I'm sorry to cut you off. It sort of reveals that self-expression. What's very odd about that is, like, it's really not self-reliant, though. Like no, in the sense...
not at all.
In what sense is it self-expression if you're having to rely on externalities that also may... I don't know, infringe on people's human rights or something like that.
That's how global capitalism works, is it's able to convince you that you're self-reliant because everything you're reliant on is invisible. Whereas in communitarianism, you can never come to accept that kind of propaganda, if you will, because you're seeing all the time everyone coming over and helping you with the barn.
Or how long it took to sew a shirt.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a human being that is not reliant on others. The question is simply if the other is invisible. And capitalism is really good at making the other invisible because it's, pushed into factories and jobs you don't see. And there's a sense in which specialized work, that these products you use are provided by some other, but it's so invisible, it's so split apart, it's so fragmented that you can't locate the other. It's some guy made the road you drove to Walmart, and somebody invented Walmart, and someone did the shelves. It's all these kind of fragmented other. It's this weird kind of fragmentation of countless others, so there is no other, where you never get a clear line of sight on the necessity of the other. Where in communitarianism, it's Bob. It's clearly the guy who's able to cut the wood while you're not. So it's much more clear, your reliance on the community. But the notion is that what ends up happening is pluralism tends to lead to a logic of expression and individual expression, which is odd, but one of the reasons is you would think it'd be the opposite. But pluralism weakens membranes. And when membranes weaken, then people feel a need to assert the individual. So there's then an assertion of the individual. But if war fails, because that's one thing that pluralism gives you is world wars and wars, well, then the next thing you can do is the quote-unquote war of the market, competition, and I will assert my individuality when I feel weak in pluralism with products, with clothing, with fashion, with status anxiety.
Yeah.
Well, once you do that, and then you just blow that up to the scale of the nation state, you enter all the multipolar traps. You enter game theory dynamics. So, basically another way to say it is we have not cracked the code on how to have pluralism and not end up in game theory dynamics that are very, very, very dangerous.
Right.
Well, what you see in the Amish is a way to avoid the game theory dynamics, but that is by lessening pluralism or lessening individual diversity, which correlate with pluralism, which then gives you a stronger membrane. But you have to give up, technology, or you have to have a democratic process by which to debate technology. Because another way to put it is pluralism tends to unleash technological essence. The logic of technology. The logic of capital and the logic of technology are two sides of the same coin. Nick Land understood that. Mikey brings that out. And pluralism tends to lead to that, for good and for bad. And while pluralism leads to that, it also tends to weaken the membranes needed to form communities that could discuss and debate the dynamics of that technology. And so that's not there, which then means that capitalism leads to a global capitalism that then unleashes technological dynamics you can't stop, or it doesn't seem like you can stop, and then you're in the multipolar trap of, do we create AI or not, Nash equilibria, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for explaining that further. It also makes me wonder if, like, a good lesson from specifically on talking on fashion or fast fashion, there's a lot of talk about that today, where people are conscious or more aware of, well, wait a second, like, we'd like to have, some sort of variety or a certain style of clothing, but we also don't want it to mean, like, cheap child labor in some small, country. So I guess for me, it actually points back to skill. It makes me think of Illich a lot, because it's like, well, maybe you could, maybe you wouldn't like end up doing how could you really do some homogenous dress with people when you are modern, really, unless you, again, formed your own little subculture or something like that, or a little community. But you could maybe say, well, they're doing this themselves, they're doing it maybe more slowly, they're doing it with a skill, they're cultivating a skill. And so I maybe I'm just making something up, but like somebody could say, well, I'm going to only allow my self-expression on my own term, on my own ability, like with my own ability, not at the expense of somebody else. Not that is necessarily at the expense of somebody else. Some people would prefer a factory job over working in a mine or something like that, So, but the point of the matter is, what I'm trying to say is that it can recalibrate how we think of self-expression and maybe link it higher to a skill versus consumption, Not that all consumption's bad, but that's a big thing with the Amish, right? They create more than they consume because they believe that's really, really important.
Well, individual expression that is expressed through a creative act is going to be very different from one that's based on, I'm an individual because I consume this, versus, X versus Y. It will also be a self-expression that is not from a motivation of alienation. That's a big thing that Marx would emphasize, is problematically, and I do think it's the truth, that most self-expression is from a fighting the feeling of anxiety or alienation or maybe mental health problems. You're actually, it's not a self-expression from a place of joy and beauty, but from a place of maybe concealing or avoiding the real and stuff like that. I would definitely say that an emphasis on skills is really important. And I think also, in Illich was really understood this. What's very interesting is what you see in the Amish is, there's a lot of people today that are like, oh, we got to get back to traditional values. We got to get back to Orthodox religion. We got to get back to the family or something. Well, the Amish suggest to you that if you're not questioning the dynamics of technology, then that's not going to help you. And that's Illich too. You've got to bring into vivid awareness. It doesn't matter if you're atheist, Christian, Muslim, liberal, whatever. If you are thoughtless about the dynamics of technology, then there are game theoretic dynamics that are going to be unleashed upon your society that no beliefs will save you from. You'll in fact, what you'll do is bend the beliefs around the technological essence. And something that's very interesting to me as well. Why aren't the Amish fascist? There's this interesting question. One does not associate Amish with fascism. And yet there are many things the Amish do that people may, once you make that, once you say that, they may think about, in fascism there can be this kind of, binding. We're all the nation, the German people. There is a critique of technology often in fascism, or getting back to the land. It's just very interesting that the Amish don't seem fascist, and the question is, why don't they? And if you can tell that difference, that might be part of this question of how we might belong today and not be regressive. Even if there's something very maybe traditionalistic about the Amish, what we see in the Amish is that the communal identity is one, not a national identity of, say, the German race, nor is it an ethno, it doesn't seem to be an ethno identity. It tends to be a communal agreement of how to relate to technology. That I think that is primary, and that seems to be why it isn't fascist, because everyone wearing the same clothing is tied to the avoiding the economic and technological system necessary for people to have different clothing, and you're avoiding a world where fascism would have corporate structures. We were talking about that with Nina at Philosophy Portal. So that's another kind of, you don't see corporate structures as like kind of the corporations that the nation state can take over in the Amish. And the Amish seem to have a different relation to the nation state. But we don't see, you would not associate the Amish with fascism. And perhaps a reason for that is because the Amish lifestyle seems to be what follows from a more democratic and communitarian relationship with technology versus, say, in fascism, maybe an ethno-identity is first. I don't really sense or get a sense of, not that I'm going to say I'm a world expert on the Amish, of an ethno or racial or national identity in the Amish. And that seems to be where you can get these, Heidegger, it's where you can take seriously some of the warnings of Heidegger against technology without ending up in Nazism. And so I think it's very interesting, the difference between fascism and the Amish.
Yeah, no, that is quite fascinating. Well, question for you, because
sure.
I guess I'm wondering, with fascism, does it typically have a kind of how do I put this? I don't know why. I just think of like a loudspeaker when I think of fascism. I don't know why. Maybe because there's sort of this sense of,
because there tends to be a strong man.
Yeah.
You don't see a strong man in the Amish.
No.
They're very anti that.
Yeah, that's it's completely the opposite. That's the thing. They're always kind of keeping themselves in check because, because, like I said, one of their main things is humility. So pride is, one of the worst things you can have in your life and in your practice of how you live your life. And I think that's why, there's this picture in here with, obviously they don't believe in taking their own photograph or pictures, but journalists and people sometimes get them, and get pictures, that is. And, there was a law in the 1950s about, truancy, and, your kids have to go to school, and it was like really interesting. They all came to sit and took off their hats and sat, in this kind of humble posture, almost apologizing, for the trouble they were causing the authorities, like that they were very sorry. And it wasn't like they were saying, they weren't groveling to say, like, we're so sorry, of course we'll send our kids to school. They didn't, right? They still chose not to do that. And they possibly faced prosecution, maybe jail time. I'm not really sure what happened in that particular instance. But the posture was one of, we're sorry to have troubled you, with our choice. And what I mean to say is that it might be one they impose upon their high schoolers, right, or their own children, but they're not going to go around saying everyone else shouldn't be having their kids in school. And to me, I think of fascism being like the loudspeaker saying, like, we've been enlightened about what's the best way to have our nation, and our nation's amazing, and this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're all going to do, and there's something quite, I don't know, there's something, I understand it's not trying to just be pushy, it's trying to restore something, like these lost values and these, this great nation, or this sense of, good pride, right? But even they seemed quite suspicious of that, you know.
Well, it you know.
And yet there are people who take quite like I don't think this would be the right word for it, but they seem to take pride in their work in the sense that they do it quite excellently, or
Sure.
they, at least on the whole, do.
Sure. No, I think that's a good association. I mean, fascism also seems to have kind of that the state and law can do work of culture, you know, in identifying with a strong man is the role of identifying with the community. So it's interesting that maybe fascism is the Amish plus nation state at scale or something. Yeah. But that just kind of presents the question of how one could take the riddles of Amish culture and direct it toward thinking the address of belonging today without ending up in something fascist. So I'm glad you've read this book, because, you know, there are some perhaps useful notions there.
Yeah, certainly. And the main thing is just, you know, it's great to learn more in depth about different ways people do decide to respond to our current age. And it's been great, and I loved the conversation as well. So thank you, Daniel.
So did I. So, for more, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you.